Last week I gave an illustration about some protesters, and I didn't even have to tell you who they were. I just told you who they weren't, and you knew who they were. I remember I said these were protesters. They weren't the vegetarians. They were do you remember what they were? Vegans, right. I didn't tell you who they were. I said who they weren't, and you figured it out. And that's how we can identify certain things by what it's not. For instance, it's not a fork, it's not a knife, it's a spoon, right? Obvious. Or the best sci-fi series ever, obviously it's not Star Trek, it's Star Wars, right? And that might create a feud among some people here, but that is the truth, I think. Today's sermon is going to be an exercise in zeroing in on what is by eliminating what is not. In Isaiah chapter 14 through 18, 19, God is showering down judgment on various nations. And it would be easy to make false assumptions about God's character in the process of this severe punishment. But we're going to read it more carefully than that. And we're going to see 7 things that God is not. In times of judgment, here are 7 things that God is not. And in doing so, we're going to get a crystal clear image of who God is. We're going to get a better view of His character and how He behaves with His creation by eliminating what He is not. So 7 things in times of judgment. And it's important to think through what might be times of judgment that you and I would endure. It's not inconceivable that God may cease to extend His patience with our country and execute judgment upon our country. And if we are in this country, we will be suffering in some degree along with our country. And if that were to come to us, it would be important for us to remember what God is not during the process, because with a limited perspective, we might start to gain a view of God that isn't true, like some of these nations did, which is why God gave these oracles through the prophets, so they wouldn't see God wrongly, but they would receive Him rightly. Perhaps judgment you might receive in your life is as a correction from going down the road of sin, or a loving admonishment from the Lord, but it feels like punishment in the moment. If you're going through that now, you may go through that in the future. Maybe you went through that in the past, and that shaped a false view of who God is in relationship to you. These 7 points will be critical for you to regain an accurate view of God's heart in all of this. So 7 things that God is not, and we're going to start in Isaiah chapter 14. Each one of these is a different nation that is given an oracle by God. Now, if I have 7 points in my sermon, that's about 3.5 minutes per point. And if I was courageous, I would give one of you a buzzer and a timer, and then I'd give it to you, and then when time ran out, you'd buzz me out. But I stand before you a coward, and I'm not going to do that. So I'll just do my best to be done at the top of the hour. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 14, and let's examine, starting in verse 1. This is speaking to Israel. And remember, we covered these chapters last week. It's a number of chapters. We're just going to take another layer at it and pull some more truth out of it before we move on. But Isaiah chapter 14, verse 1, "For the Lord will have compassion on Jacob, and will again choose Israel, and will set them in their own land, and sojourners will join them, and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. And the peoples will take them and bring them into their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in the Lord's land as male and female slaves. They will take captive those who were their captors, and rule over those who oppressed them." So chapter 14 is an oracle for Israel. Verses 4 through 21 is a taunt against Babylon, the captors of Israel, those who are coming in and devastating Israel. And yet here, in the midst, on the cusp of this devastation, they're given a prophetic taunt. Here's how you're going to make fun of your enemies when you're ruling over them. This would be the equivalent of say, Iraq being given a taunt over the U.S. just before Operation Desert Storm. It seems unlikely and incongruent with observable reality, and yet God is saying it will happen. What He's offering them is a glimpse into the future. You will be restored. I'm not done with you yet. And that's the first thing that God is not. God is not finished. He's not finished. In this 18-verse taunt, God is sending His people a message. He's sending them the same message that He sends you this morning in times of judgment, in times of correction, in times of discipline. Don't forget this pivotal truth. God is not finished. We look at verse 1 and the word compassion jumps out at me. For the Lord will have compassion on Jacob. Compassion is actually the first word in the Hebrew sentence for emphasis. And so it's really saying compassion is what the Lord has for you, Israel. Because He's not done with you. In the depth of this judgment, it feels like He's turned His back on you. But we're only at the beginning parts of the process. He's not done. The word again jumps out at me. He says, I will again choose Israel. In the book of life, every chapter feels like the last one, doesn't it? I think I've said that before, but it bears repeating. It's worth repeating. As we experience the book of life, every chapter feels like the last one. Whether we're at a high point, success, it'll never be stripped from me. This is great. Or whether you're in the depths of despair, you think this is how it's going to end. But it's not. If you were to grab your Bible and hold it up in front of you, or a hymnal, and think, okay, where am I in the story of my life? And we tend to go towards the back. We think that's where I'm at. But the reality is we're quite in the beginning chapter still. And even if you are very elderly in life, you still have a whole library of books to come in eternity future, because God is not finished yet with what He's expressing to you, with what He is doing with you. You are His workmanship. And He's not even in the polishing process yet. He's still rough forming what He's going to make out of you. He's not finished yet. So God is calling from the back pages of the book. He's saying, don't stop reading. I'm not done yet. I'm not finished. I'm still working on you. Don't give up. Don't close the book. There's more to come. That's what He was telling Israel. That's what He's telling us. So whether it's relapse or divorce or depression or rejection, God's not finished with you yet. Whether it's affliction through loss or divine rebuke or searing conviction, God's not done with you yet. He's not finished with what He's seeking to accomplish in your life. And He's using even this sermon right now and what He's whispering in your spirit to convince you there's more to come. And it's not just any future, it's a promised rest. Look at verse 3. When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, this taunt against the worldly system that presses in on us at all times. But what we have here is a promise of rest. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament picks up this theme in Hebrews chapter 4. It says that promise of rest still stands for us, for you and I, for the church. The promise of entering His rest still stands. And so as the rest remains, we must strive to enter that rest. Those are the choices we talked about last week with Babylon. We can waltz into Babylon and find destruction, or we can strive for the rest that God promises each of us. One thing that God is not in your life and in mine, God is not finished. The second thing God is not in times of judgment, discipline, or correction. And somewhat by way of review, we see this in chapter 14, verses 24. Verses 24 to 27. Here now He's addressing an oracle. It's an oracle concerning Assyria. And what we see here is God is not passive. He's not passive. As Assyria decimated the Holy Land, it would have been tempting for God's people to think that God was distant. that God was hands off. Even his back was turned to his people. And they would say, that's not a temptation. That is a pretty obvious observation that God is negligently passive in allowing this terrible thing that is being perpetrated upon me. But look what God says, starting in verse 24. The Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so it shall be, and as I have purposed, so it shall stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot, and his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder. This is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? At times it would hurt too much to even imagine that God is not allowing this thing to happen, this discipline in my life, this correction, this suffering in my life. It seems incomprehensible, not that just He's allowing it, but He's actually orchestrating it. How can that be? And though it is painful, there's comfort in this truth that God is not passive in my suffering. He's active and intimate in it. He's close to me. I think of a quote from Spurgeon. I've read it before. Spurgeon endured considerable suffering in his life. He suffered from depression. He suffered from public scorn and slander. In fact, and even public sabotage of his ministry. And looking back at those years in his life, he referred to it as, if I was buried with Christ during that time, then I remain dead. He was permanently altered by these public assaults on his ministry and sabotage. He suffered the agony of debilitating gout. But here's how he viewed it. He said, so far as personal sorrows are concerned, it would be a very sharp and trying experience to me to think that I have an affliction which God never sent me, that the bitter cup was never filled by His hand, that my trials were never measured out by Him, nor sent to me by His arrangement of their weight and quantity. He understood, he preferred, if it's going to be bad, I'd rather it be from the hand of God, who loves me and is for me and knows my capacity, than just to be suffering at the hands of someone who loves me not. God is the engineer of your being, and He knows precisely the allowable tolerances that you can endure without breaking. You know that? He created you. He engineered you. He knows you better than you know you, and He knows exactly how far you can stretch and bend without breaking, and that brings me comfort. Because it seems like every time it gets bad for me, I think, how could it get worse? And then it does. And I think, how much more can I take? But if it's coming from the hand of God, I know whatever comes, I know it comes with a plan. I know He loves me, and I know He's not seeking to destroy me. We can visualize this with a straw. How far? Let's see. Someone, Daniel, you come up here. Grab a few of these. Give some to some other. Grab them. There you go. Take one yourself. Give one to Dan. Give one to Jason Lane back there. Anyone else that wants one. This is good for you to visualize. Just think about how far can I stretch. Let's see, among those who have a straw, give one to Andrew. There we go. All right, guys. How far can you stretch it without breaking it? You break it, you lose. All right. Daniel, you got to get one too. All right, ready? So let's see how far you can stretch it. Oh, mine broke. Yours broke, Jason? No. Eric, Dan, how far? Hold it up. Let's see. Mine's broken. Huh? The whole way. You've stretched it as far as it will go. This straw is you and I. This is our life. And we're getting stretched. And it feels painful. I tried to look up on the internet, what is the pound force that your average drinking straw can sustain before it breaks? I couldn't find the answer. Google didn't know. But maybe whoever engineered the straw knows the answer. And if this straw is our life, God surely knows the answer. And we're assured in the New Testament that He's not going to give you any temptation without also giving you a way of escape. And the temptation is there for us to endure, to make us more holy. The testing is there to draw us closer to Him. His desire is not to break us. Remember what Jesus said to Peter? He's like, Satan has desired you to sift you like wheat. He wants to shake you around in a sieve and separate you from your faith. But He had to come to me first. He had to ask permission. And I gave Him permission. But when you return, strengthen the brothers. God is not desiring that we bend to the point of breaking. He's stretching us for our good. He knows what's best. He's not passive in our suffering. He knows you so well. I think of Psalm 139. What a great passage of comfort so many times in my life. Psalm 139, starting in verse 13, says, God, you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. Here's the best part. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. So before any human laid eyes on you, God saw you. And His observation was, this is wonderful. I cannot wait to introduce this person to the world and the world to this person. And He was meticulous in engineering every detail of who you are and who you would grow into be. Not just physical makeup, but God crafted your passions and your personality, your loves, your interests, the things that make you laugh, the trials you would face, the heartache you would endure, the victories you would celebrate, the deepest valleys of dark death, the highest peaks of exhilaration. All of that was written into His book before your umbilical cord was even cut. And that brings me comfort in days where I feel like judgment is raining down upon me, to know God is not passive in this. He is with me. So God is not finished with you yet. And God is not passive in what you are currently experiencing. What else can we learn from what God is not? The third oracle is a warning to Philistia for us. So it's a warning to Philistia, but it's for us. And it's chapter 14, beginning in verse 28 to 32. It says, in the year that King Ahaz died, came this oracle. Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken. For from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. And the firstborn of the poor will graze, and the needy lie down in safety. But I will kill your root with famine, and your remnant it will slay. Wail, O gate, cry out, O city. Melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you, for smoke comes out of the north, and there is no straggler in his ranks. So he's forming this picture of, you think you're going to be delivered, and you will, but the next enemy is even worse. And they're marching in, and every one of the soldiers is strong. They have burning cities behind them. The smoke billows as a warning. Here they come. Not one of the soldiers is a straggler. Every one of them coming and bringing judgment. Time to wail, time to cry out, time to melt in fear. And who was Philistia? The Philistines. The Philistines were the traditional archetype enemy of Israel. And what are the Philistines doing in this passage? Look at verse 32. What will one answer the messengers of the nation? So what are they doing? As you compare this with other passages in Isaiah, it becomes more clear that the Philistines are coming to Israel to solicit solidarity against their common enemy, Assyria. They're sending an envoy to Israel. Israel's ancient enemy, the Philistines, are coming to Israel and saying, let's team up because Assyria is big and bad, and we're all afraid of Assyria. And what is God doing in this? Again, in verse 32, God is asking the question, what will your answer be, Israel? What are you going to say when your enemy comes to you and asks for an alliance against what they consider a greater threat? So here's what God is not, as I see it in verses 28 to 32. God is not plan B. Because what does he say? He says, the Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. So God is asking, who are you going to find refuge in, Israel? Are you going to find refuge in me? Or are you going to find refuge in your historic enemies? Who are you going to lean on? Who are you going to hope in? God won't be your fallback or your contingency. He wants to be your first resort. He wants to be your primary recourse. If you make God your plan B, which is essentially what Israel was doing here, they were teaming up with any nation that would come to them instead of simply relying on God. Instead of understanding, we are the chosen nation. God has a plan for us. He's active in this. I'm not afraid. Instead, they were seeking to avoid any discipline whatsoever and team up even with their dreaded enemies. And God's saying, you're making me plan B. And you, ladies and gentlemen, make God plan B when you don't go to Him until only after you've exhausted every other effort. You don't go to God until your first and second and third plan fail. Then it's time to start praying. That's making God your plan B. God is not plan B. He must be our first recourse. So what does making God plan A look like? Prayer is a big part of it. Prayer is an absolute big part of it. It demonstrates what we really trust in. If you think, I don't have time to pray in the morning, then you're admitting my efforts are far more important than prayer. My efforts are more effective than God's efforts. That's what you're saying if you go and start your day without prayer. God is not plan B. He does not honor those who treat Him as plan B. The choice that He gave Zion, are you going to trust in the Philistines? Or the choice He gave Israel, are you going to trust in the Philistines or are you going to trust in me? Will you find refuge in me or in your enemies and my enemies? So God is not finished in what He's doing in your life. God is not passive in your suffering. God is not plan B. He refuses to be. And the fourth thing that God is not is in chapters 15 and 16. And I find this kind of rather startling. It's interesting. So you look at the heading in chapter 15. It says, an oracle concerning Moab. So a brief review of who Moab is. Remember the Moabites, ancient people. They were the offspring of Lot's, you remember Lot and Abram, Lot's and the drunken night of incest that Lot had with his daughter, that became the Moabite people. They were a pagan land from the beginning. They were the first ones that tried to hire Balaam. Remember Balaam and his donkey? The Moabites were the ones that hired Balaam to curse Israel. They were constantly at war with Israel. For 18 years in the book of Judges, under Eglon, the Moabites oppressed Israel. Throughout the Psalms, they're mentioned several times, and every time the Moabites are mentioned, they're referred to as enemies of God and His people. And what do we see in Isaiah 15? Because of Moab, Moab is laid waste in a night. Moab is undone. Because Kir of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. He has gone up to the temple and to Dibon, to the high places, to weep over Nebo and over Medeba, and Moab wails. On every head is baldness, every beard is shorn. In the streets they wear sackcloth. On the housetops in their squares everyone wails and melts in tears. Heshbon and Elihu cry out. Their voice is heard as far as Jahaz. Therefore the armed men of Moab cry aloud. His soul trembles. Look down at verse 7. Therefore the abundance they have gained and what they have laid up, they carry away over the brooks of the willows. For a cry has gone around the land of Moab. Her wailing reaches to Eglaim. Her wailing reaches to Bir-elim. For the waters of Dibon are full of blood. For I will bring upon Dibon even more, a lion, those of Moab who escape for the remnant of the land. So he's telling me these terrible things that are happening to the enemy of God. And what would you expect God's emotional response to be to this destruction? If you were Israel, what would your emotional response be to the destruction of Moab, the weeping and wailing and moaning and desolation of Moab? What would your response be? When you see your enemies suffer, what is your emotional response? God's is surprising. You look at chapter 15, and we see God has a surprising response. He says in verse 5, my heart, God says, my heart cries out for Moab. Her fugitives flee. For at the ascent of Luith they go up weeping on the road to Horonoim, and they raise a cry of destruction. But he says, my heart cries out for them. What does he say down in chapter 16? He sees them fleeing like birds, scattering in the wind. And he says to Israel, give counsel, grant justice, make your shade like a night at the height of noon. Shelter the outcast. Do not reveal the fugitive. Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn among you. Be a shelter to them from the destroyer. When the oppressor is no more and destruction has ceased, he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land. Then a throne will be established in steadfast love. And on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. And so we have God crying out for Moab in the destruction that He has ordained for them. He's calling out that Israel become a refuge for them. What's more than that, we look at, let's see if I can find it, verse 9. Listen to what God says. Therefore I weep with the weeping of Jazer for the vines of Sibmah. I drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Elelah. For your summer fruit and your harvest, the shout has ceased, and the joy of gladness are taken away from the fruit of the field. And in the vineyard no songs are sung, no cheers are raised, no treader treads out the winepress. I've put an end to the shouting. Therefore, he said, I have put an end to this. Therefore, my inner parts moan like a lyre for Moab. That's an instrument. Like, I feel like the moaning of a cello, God says, for those of you who I'm punishing. Isn't that amazing? So what we find out in this is that God is not heartless. God is not heartless. He's not stoically rendering judgment on His enemies. He does it begrudgingly because He loves His creation. Put ourselves in Moab's position, who surely deserve that punishment. From their perspective, God would appear to be unfeeling and stoic when actually He is full of heart-wrenching compassion for His creation, even for His enemies. We see that with Christ hanging on the cross. One of the last things He said, what did He say? Cried out, Father, forgive them. Forgive these people that are crucifying me right now. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. He says that to you and to I as well. Romans chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. God demonstrates His love for us in that while we were sinners, He died for us. While we were the Moabites, He died for us. While we were enemies, it says in verse 10 of Romans 5, He reconciled us to Christ. When we had nothing to offer Him, He showed compassion on us, His creation. And even those whom He punishes, His heart wrenches when He does it. God is not heartless. So we have 3 lessons quickly yet to learn from God's intense judgment on these peoples. The 5th thing that God is not. This 5th thing is a thing that He refuses to be. But before we get there, which is in chapter 17, 1 through 14, let's put up on the board there a coded message. Can you put that up there, Caleb? All right, that's a message to you. Can anyone decode it? I wouldn't be surprised if there's someone here that could decode the message. If I gave you enough time, I bet you could figure it out in time. If I put the key up there, put the next slide up and just hold that there for a while. Now you can definitely decode it, given enough time. Oftentimes, life feels like an inscrutable cipher. We can't make sense of the jumble of circumstances and events and a seeming smattering of random feelings and conflicts and positives and negatives that shape our lives in what seems to be almost an arbitrary way. But with an accurate key, the cipher of life can be discerned. So life feels like those digits underneath. No rhyme or reason. What am I supposed to make of this? But when we have the key, we understand what God is doing. So what's the message? Hello. Very simple. Put that up there, Caleb, for those that missed it. There it is. Hello. In Isaiah chapter 17, we see both. We see the confusion of life, but then we see the key that makes everything come into focus, and we understand why the things that are happening are happening. So let's look at Isaiah chapter 17 briefly. In Isaiah chapter 17, we see Damascus, an oracle concerning Damascus. And what we see, if we had more time and you could read through it more carefully, you would see a strong people that are productive, that are relying on themselves, and God saying, I'm going to make you fruitless. I'm going to take away all your strengths. I'm going to remove it, and whatever you're doing in life, I'm going to make it rot. You're not going to have the things that you once had. And here's why, he said. You're going to be brought low. You're going to be diminished. You're not going to be fruitful. You look at verse 6. He says, the gleanings will be left in it as when an olive tree is beaten. 2 or 3 berries in the top of the highest bough. 4 or 5 on the branches of the fruit tree. You're going to be like a fruit tree that's already been stripped of all its fruit. Maybe there's one rotten one way at the top. That's going to be your national output. Why is that happening? Because God refuses to be ignored. One thing God is not, He is not going to be ignored. He's going to have all this devastation, verses 1 through 6 and 17. And why is He doing it? Here's the code that breaks the cipher. Here's how we understand it. Verse 7, in that day, man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel. He will not look to the altars, to the works of his hands. He will not look to what his own fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense. In that day, their strong cities will be like the deserted places of the wooded heights and the hilltops, which they deserted because of their children of Israel. And there will be desolation. Why? Here's the key. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation and have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Therefore, though you plant pleasant plants and sow the vine branch of a stranger, and though you make them grow on the day that you plant them and make them blossom in the morning that you sow, yet the harvest will flee away in a day of grief and incurable pain. Because God says, I will not be forgotten. In all that God is doing in your life, He is shouting down to you from heaven, don't ignore me. I'm too good to be ignored. You miss out if you ignore me, God says. To those of us beings who, just to think of it, the hubris that we have, God He is actively sustaining your existence. If He ceased to actively sustain your existence, you would be gone, and we forget Him. And we turn away, and He throws stuff in our life that feels painful at the time. But what He's doing is calling out to you, don't forget me. Don't forget me. Real quickly, glad I didn't have that buzzer. We're going to wrap this up in 5 minutes. 2 more. We're getting a much clearer view of God, I think, though, a sharper image of who God is by eliminating who He is not. And now for the 6th thing that God is not flustered. Real quickly, chapter 18, verses 1 through 7 gives us a real interesting picture of contrast. All the land of whirring wings, a land of whirring wings. So he's given a picture of these bugs that are flying everywhere in the land. They fill the land, constant noise and motion, every direction, gnats in the ears and the throat and the nose. The air itself swirls with annoyance like if you're in a marsh. Have you ever been in a marsh or maybe a river with thick banks and the bugs are just a cloud? That's how he's describing Cush, which is actually Ethiopia, probably. And they were strong people. It says, which sends ambassador by the sea and vessels of papyrus on waters. Go, you swift messengers, to the nation tall and smooth, to a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide. So he's painting a picture of emissaries running quickly. And he sees, you see boats going over rapid water. They're light boats to navigate the rapids. You have a land that is divided by rivers, meaning the land itself is chopped up by moving waters. The picture presented here is unrelenting commotion and ongoing tumult. Does your life feel that way sometimes? Does it feel like an ongoing tumult? Never-ending commotion? But look what God says about himself in verse 4. For thus the Lord said to me, I will quietly look from my dwelling, like clear heat in a sunshine, like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. So God says, you guys all may be in a tumult down there, but not me. I'm quietly gazing down from heaven, silent as a heat wave rising off the blacktop on a summer day. I'm as still as the evaporating dew. You all may be in turmoil, pandemonium may ensue, but I'm not fretting. I'm not pacing the halls of heaven. I'm not wringing my hands along with you. One thing God is not flustered, which is good to know when we are. What is going on, Lord? He's okay. He's got it. He's executing a plan slowly and surely. And I think by way of application, Isaiah is urging us to adopt an attitude of quiet faith in God. God is undisturbed, so ought we to be. God is quietly contemplating the frenzy, unfazed. Let us mimic our Father. Let us walk in His footsteps. Let's not take our cues from the national media. Let's not listen to those rebel rousers. Let's follow our Father. Let's begin our days settled in Him. You know, there's a reason why they used to call morning devotions quiet time. Some of you may still call it quiet time, because it's where we sit down with God and He rubs off on us. He's not flustered. He's eternal. He's not caught up in our day like we are. One final thing that God is not, and I'll let you look through chapter 19 on your own in more detail. This is concerning Egypt. In verses 1 through 15, we see essentially the destruction of Egypt. But what God is demonstrating in verses 16 through 25 is God is not short-sighted. God is not short-sighted. Maybe the most comforting thing of all. God is not short-sighted. Why do we say that? Look at verse 16. And with that, let's have our worship team come up as well, please. In that day, the Egyptians will be like women and tremble in fear before the hand of the Lord of hosts shakes over them. And the land of Judah will become a terror to the Egyptians, and everyone whom it is mentioned will fear because of the purpose that the Lord of hosts has purposed against them. And the Israelites are thinking, good, we're going to subjugate Egypt. But then God says, in that day, there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the city of destruction. In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, a pillar to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. When they cry to the Lord because of oppressors, He will send them a Savior and defender and deliver them. And the Lord will make Himself known to the Egyptians. And the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day and worship with sacrifice and offering. And they will make vows to the Lord and perform them. And the Lord will strike Egypt, striking and healing. And Egypt, will return to the Lord. And He will listen to their pleas for mercy and heal them. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and Assyria will become like Egypt, and Egypt into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. What God is doing, He's taking the 2 most feared enemies of Israel, and He's bringing them in. He's saying in all of this, they are going to learn to worship me. Verse 24, in that day Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, blessed be Egypt, my people. What? Now can you believe God is saying Egypt will be my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance? God is playing the long game. He's playing it right now in your life. He's not short-sighted. He is executing a planned strategy that will bring Him the most glory and humanity the most good in the end. So when it seems like you don't know what He's doing, that's okay. He knows what He's doing. And what He's doing is orchestrating, eventually, global recognition of His glory. That's the long game. So this is who God is. He calmly plays the long game, unflustered, refusing to be ignored, because if we could ignore him, that would be the most unfortunate thing for us. He is compassionate towards those he afflicts, strategically active in your life, but not yet completed his work on you. So your response is to make him your priority number one.